record. That's what the ding is. Okay, cool. Then, and let me adjust my view. Sorry. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. All right, so the case, yes, the case itself is pretty straightforward, right? I think you probably, even on a cursory glance at the article, get this stuff. So Indians, East Ohio, and the point being that they are not formally recognized. And that meaning that there are procedures in place where the federal government recognizes certain people as members of Native American tribes, and you can be literally a card carrying Indian. You can literally have a card that says, like, yes, you are a member of, well, and it's very complicated, right? They don't get too deep into it, but there are a number of tribes that are recognized. There are a number of tribes that aren't recognized by the federal government because the federal government never had treaties with them. So these are people who are not formally recognized, and also, generally speaking, not what they call, phenotypically recognizable as Indians. So the basic idea is that if you saw these folks on the street, you would most likely mistake them for white people. Although I was trying to figure out like who these people are. It's kind of difficult to find really much about. Indians like this. I think this is a pretty obscure subset of people that these authors are dealing with. They did find a little bit on it though, and like somebody was saying that he's often mistaken for Mexican and has to deal with that, or being Hispanic. And he said he had somebody even telling him like, go back to your own country. He's like, wait a minute, look, I'm Native American, hold on. So again, phenotypically, just meaning physically recognizable as having the traits that people stereotypically associate with Native Americanness. As part of the background here, and really, this could be, a bigger part of a culture course, is the discussion of Omi and Wenant. And so if you took inequality with me, you would have read Omi and Wenant's article about racial projects. And they're putting this at least somewhat in this rubric of racial projects, saying that creating Indianness is a racial project on the part of the dominant classes. And this is a nice, from a sort of a broader social culture point of view, this is a nice article sort of idea to kind of look at, because here you really have a place where structure and culture come together to create a social formation. So the structure in general being the dominant structures, the political structures, the economic structures, the culture being, you know, what does race mean? Or what do certain phenotypical characteristics mean, or what counts as being a race? Those come together and they are sort of solidified, made concrete in the social formations of race and society. And in particular, the argument that they're making here is that the US government limits the number of recognized Indians. And to a somewhat lesser extent, well, and the reason that they do that, of course, is to reduce the number of obligations that Americans have to Indians, or that the government has to Indians. The fewer officially recognized Indians there are, the less we owe them. And there are certain programs that are special carve out for Indian special entitlement programs that that we don't use for people who aren't identified as Indians. Is that a hand, Sophia?
Yeah. I was just curious what basis they go off of, like who's Native American or not, like the government.
Right. So, and again, I'm definitely not a specialist on this topic.
Right.
As I understand it, again, there's only certain tribes that are recognized by the federal government, and this really goes back to all those treaties that the U.S. signed from the early 19th century through the early 20th century, that basically established, like, okay, you people can have this land, and we recognize you as, and I'm hesitant to even say particular tribes because I really don't know this stuff that well, but like the Navajo, like, are clearly like recognized. Seminole Indians are not. And I can't think off the top of my head, but there are like certain tribes in Massachusetts and other places in New York State where they're not official Indian tribes. Because, and they are people who are descended from, first people, from people who lived here before the Europeans, but the federal government never entered into a treaty with them, and so they're not official Indians. So yeah, this kind of crazy thing that goes back like way into history. And what that then also means, though, is that some ancestor of yours had to be a member of one of these recognized tribes. And if you can trace your lineage back to one of those people, then you can be a card-carrying Indian. Otherwise, you don't count. I did know one guy who was sort of in that boat. It was like, he had one great-grandparent who was a Native American, and he, most of the time I knew him, it's like, this is just a red-haired white guy. And it was such a weird story. And we go on a road trip one time, and he says, hey, if you see a dead eagle on the side of the road, or like a dead hawk, let me know, because I'm allowed to collect those and get the feathers. And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? And he was like, no, my great-great-grandmother was whatever kind of Indian, and I have a card, I have a letter that says that, like, I'm an Indian and I'm allowed to collect, because I guess there's something in the Migratory Bird Act, you're not supposed to collect eagle feathers, but he's allowed to. So they're out there. And again, he, because the government recognized whatever tribe, his ancestors are part of, he gets to be a card-carrying Indian. A lot of folks do not. And so that's, part of this racial project, really the more structural part. We don't have to give resources to the people, then that's easier for the government. Also, though, we should recognize that partly recognized Indians, I don't know how to put this exactly, but also benefit because they have more resources. Fewer people there, or the fewer the people there are to spread the wealth around, then the more wealth there are. So if you're already a card carrying, Mohicans. That's one of the particular tribes in this part of the country, right? So the Mohicans, is that right? Or Mohawk Indians in far western New York, northeastern Pennsylvania. If you're a member of that tribe, you get so much from the federal government. You don't want to share the wealth. You don't want to spread it any thinner. And so there are some real structural dimensions here that make it difficult for these folks, who they call reclaimers, to get recognition as Indians. That is also tied into the cultural dimension, though, more. In terms of what stereotypes we apply to Indianness, and by we, they're talking about Americans in general. And what that goes to is, again, phenotype. As Americans are kind of obsessed with the way that you look. If you don't look like an Indian, it's going to be more difficult for you to be recognized as one. So, like I say, a pale-skinned, red-haired guy did not look like an Indian to me, right? As opposed to, the stereotypes. You can sort of think of the long, dark, straight hair, darker skin, that sort of thing that people associate with Indianness. So there's that, and there's also, again, there's this back and forth with the structure. The way that history is told, to the extent that you read about Native Americans in your history books, either the Indians were killed or they ended up on reservations. One of my kids, my son just went through a bit of this in his 8th grade history class, and the story there was that and even that's a false, it's such anyway. The Trail of Tears, right? They took the Cherokee and the Creek, and some Seminoles from Georgia and Florida, and Andrew Jackson marched them way the fuck to Oklahoma, right? And so now there are Cherokee reservations in Oklahoma, and anybody who didn't make it, died, right? That's why it's the Trail of Tears. And again, that's not really true. You can go to Cherokee reservations or at least I don't know if they're actually formal reservations. You can go to, there are Cherokee people still living in Georgia, and also, and more particularly for this article, this misses, let's see how far I have to write here. This misses urban Indians. The Indians who didn't go to reservations, the Indians who moved off of reservations over the course of the 20th century, and then married, not necessarily with Indians, had kids, had lives, adopted more of the sort of the dominant American culture. Those folks are really not they're not in the culture. You can't watch movies about people. There was one, now I'm going to completely forget the name. There was one book that came out last year that was kind of celebrated for telling the story of some of these people. But you don't read very many books like that. You don't see these folks out there in the culture. Again, the history, the story that we're told is that Indians, are basically dark people who live on reservations. And so that, in addition to the particularity of the social structure there, makes it so that these reclaimers have a very difficult time adapting the identity of being Native American, being Indian. Okay, so that's a lot of background. Let me refresh my screen here. Okay. So what is this? So the real crux of this article, as an article in the journal Symbolic Interaction, is to look at identity as an interactive accomplishment. We saw a little bit of that in the article on trans people. Or really a decent amount, I guess, really, in terms of how one performs maleness or femaleness to be recognized as such by other people in interactions. And the question, in large part, is about whether people will validate your identity or not. So again, the broadest point is to look at identity as an interactive accomplishment. And the particular problem faced by these reclaimers is that they're held to be frauds or wannabes. I assume you're all, wait a minute, where can I? You disappeared for me. I'm gonna get you back. No. There you are. Okay. You've heard of wannabes before. Maybe. Yes, right. So you want to, basically, essentially, you want to be something that you are not officially recognized or publicly recognized as being, or more, I guess, more pointedly, the stereotype that they're going for here is you want to be something other than what you legitimately are. Essentially saying these people, these reclaimers, are not Indian and they want to be Indian, but they don't really work, or they're out and out frauds. And it should, well, so this is where I start to get a little bit sticky, or this all seems to start to seem a little bit sticky to me, is to whether there can legitimately or authentically be people who are fraudulent, who claim to possess an identity which they do not. Really, the claim excuse me, and this is a claim that we see specifically within this article, but yes, Elizabeth Warren, except yes and no, right? So the weird thing with Warren is that Warren would count as a reclaimer. I guess anybody could count as a reclaimer, but Warren has a little bit more authenticity, purchase, whatever on it, because she does have this ability to go back and say, some, and I don't know if she's a 32nd part or a 64th part Native American, but somewhere back in her lineage, she can say that gives her some degree of legitimacy. I was thinking of there was a while when Johnny Cash was going around saying that he was Native American, and then they did the research and they're like, no, Johnny Cash, you have no Native Americanness to you, in your blood whatsoever. And this is kind of a trope in American society, right? People who go out and claim to be, there's some, I have some Cherokee in my blood, or whatever it is. There are, in that sense, some people who are, I guess you'd say, out and out frauds, or I don't know if you've encountered any of these people, but there are there are even Europeans who adopt the garb of Native Americans and build sweat lodges, and they'll even start spas that are basically around being Native American, even though they have no Native Americanness to them. In this sense, they really are fraudsters who are seeking to get money out of people by claiming that they are Native American and giving them this authentic Native American experience. And you can see, or at least I could see, how that could be perceived as detrimental to legitimate Indians, who don't want their culture appropriated and don't want it to be sold as a, commodified item. The claim, though, of reclaimers, in at least to some extent, and I think of cultural sociology in general. Certainly, you see this in gender studies. Certainly, that's a part of the gender article that we read. Is that all identity is performative? Identity, is performative. And again, the example with gender is that gender is something that you do, not something that you have, right? So the claim being that, essentially what Sheldon Westbrook were arguing is that, trans men are gendered as men because they're doing the gendered things that are necessary to being men. or that are culturally understood as being male, and or masculine. And in the same sense, we could think of this. They don't use this term, but essentially saying reclaimers are doing Indian. Now, many of them do have, they argue, some lineage which would make them, in a different sense, legitimate, right? They keep on talking about Indian blood. But some of them really make this argument that all that's necessary for being an Indian is to enact the practices of being an Indian. So what does that mean? Let me go back here a little bit. So for identity to be an interactive accomplishment, what they're trying to avoid is, or to refute, are these claims that they are frauds or wannabes. And this goes to while at the same time identity is performative, it also requires validation. And I mean, I guess this is part of my, whatever white cis male privilege thing is that, like, I've never, to my recollection, been invalidated in an interaction. Like, my identity, it's like, I go to the grocery store or whatever, it's like, there's an old white dude, like there's plenty of old white dudes, it's really easy to be validated as such. Of course, though, there are plenty of other identities that are in, somewhat more question. Well, I guess if I went to Ireland, right, and I really wanted to, like, claim, like, well, my name is Dempsey, and, like, my whatever grandparents were Irish people, and I went to Ireland and started going around saying I was Irish, they'd probably be like, nah, you're American, dude. Like, that, you just don't count. So we need this validation. I tend to think about it a bit more in terms of, so obviously it goes to gender, it goes to ethnicity, and there are people for whom this is clearly problematic. If you're a very light-skinned Native American, you might not be able to make this claim. If you're a very light-skinned Hispanic person who doesn't have a Hispanic last name, I could imagine this being a problem for you. If you try to go to some, like, Latino community organization, they'll be like, you're not a real Latino. That kind of thing can happen to you. But it also happens, I would argue, in all kinds of identities. If you want to, so being a college professor, is an example very close to me, right? I suppose one could be invalidated as a college professor or as, like, a chef. If you do the work to be a chef, and you learn how to properly be a chef, you'd be very embarrassed, or you'd have some sort of an identity crisis almost if somebody wrote an article about your restaurant and said, like, that person is not a chef, like, this person doesn't count. And I'm trying to think, like, there are certainly different subcultures of people to whom this is, very important, right? So it's like, you're not a proper goth. You're not a proper, straight edge is one that Can't remember. Is that mentioned in this article? Did straight edge come up? Like straight edge is and I don't really know the extent to which straight edge is straight edge a thing anymore? Like, are there straight?
Like a
Not
goody
so
two shoes?
much. It was
That's
started
right.
the punk movement in America. So it was always a really interesting aspect of it.
Are there like, do you know straight edge people?
Yeah.
What's the definition of that?
It's just
They're-
people that don't do drugs or alcohol. They're sober.
Yeah, okay.
They don't need like substances. They're like
Yeah,
kind
that's
of
what
like
I thought.
substances.
Yeah, but not again though, right? Like it's a punk thing, so it's not like really nice like middle American like Christian kids who don't do drugs. It's like they're punk and they're critical of the system and like But again, that's kind of the question is like, what do you have to do to be counted as straight edge? And it's somewhat of an identity crisis or an identity problem for people. If you go, I don't know, you go to a new town, you go to a show, and you're performing as straight edge, and people say, well, you're not really straight edge because you don't X, Y, Z, right? So this can be a problem for any kind of an identity. And again, the point here is that it's something that you give off in that old Goffmanian sense, right? You give off different signs to people. And of course, this is why this is a core sociology of culture concern, is because it really is about the sort of signs that you give off. These semiotic, these things that are meaningful, whether that's the patches that you have, whether it's the color of your skin, and so on. It's stuff you give off, but then very much it's the stuff you get back. It's that validation. It's that acceptance as being a part of that identity. For this group in particular, to be able to appropriate, it's not really the proper word, to be able to, I guess, display the identity of Native Americanness, it requires a redefinition of that identity. And so in particular, for these guys, that is, let me write this down. Maybe I didn't write this down. This is that stuff of, the other centric ethos. And really, that is just a kind of a way of going back to saying identity isn't something that you have. It's not, in your blood, but it's something that you do. So if you do the other-centric ethos, which is that thing of like, I would give somebody the shirt off my back. I will look out for other people before doing things for myself or making sure that I eat. The other-centric ethos, and also in particular traditions, like, we see a little bit of this in the article. She doesn't really go into much depth, but there's something about tobacco. Again, this article is a little bit frustrating to me, just because it's always scratching the surface, and thinking like, well, what is that about? There is some, I guess there's a great many Native American traditions around tobacco. and not really just in terms of, or maybe not at all in terms of like smoking to get the nicotine buzz, but really seeing tobacco as this sacred plant that you'll grow it in certain places for good luck, or you'll put it in a pipe and smoke it in a ceremony, but you really won't, inhale in the sense of, trying to get a nicotine high off of it. You're just communing with some kind of important spirit, that kind of thing. So tobacco is highlighted here, but powwows, which are largely, well, amongst other things, in addition to just the communal experience, drumming and dancing and ceremonies in general. If you can redefine the identity as things that you do, then that claim becomes more legitimated. The interesting step that they take, though, from there is, well, should point out, in the community in general, folks don't buy this, and clearly we get these anecdotes, stories from the interviewees about how, they went to the Native American Center and, they tried to get food at the food bank or something like that. And they said like, oh, you're not an authentic Indian. You're not a card carrying Indian. You don't look like us, take a hike. So there are some real material interests that these people have in saying, no, that shouldn't be what the identity is. But really, in order to do that, is it still showing up? Yes, okay. In order to do that, they say it requires a proximate social structure. So again, this is kind of a nice article in terms of giving us some sense of, not just reflection, but the back and forth that goes on between social structure and culture. By proximate social structure, they're talking about social structures that are close to you, social structures that, colloquially we would probably call community. And saying, that in general, this kind of validation for your identity comes from a proximate social structure. And, you can think of that in any number of ways in your own lives. And of course, I think this is, part of the strain of coronavirus, right? The strain of social isolation. You're no longer able to do the things that make you, a full-on college student, especially, in particular, an Eckerd College student, nor are you able to have people there in your lives validating that identity, right? So now your salient identities are going back to, being a member of your family. And of course, you can always draw on that. And it's a salient and important identity in and of itself, but it's not necessarily what you've gotten used to or who you're used to being. And so I imagine that is quite a strain. So they're saying really everybody in life needs this kind of validation to legitimately or to feel legitimate in enacting their identities. And so in particular, in this case, they talk about a community center. And a community center that was also, focused on, well, not just acceptance, but also education. And by saying it's about education, it's saying, we're willing, we're happy to teach you what being an Indian is about, or willing to and happy to teach you about these ceremonies. And you hear even to some extent that, in addition to the reclaimers who do have some claim on having a Native American ancestry, they're saying, we don't even really care. It's like, if, blood or not blood, some of these guys are saying, yeah, you can have no Indian blood and we'll still recognize you as an American Indian if you come to the center and get educated and perform the traditions. And of course, though, for our purposes, we want to always be able to carry these articles out to other sorts of things. They do a bit of that themselves, the authors do, in terms of looking at online forums. They do so in a really positive way, in terms of talking about Black Greek life. They referenced this one article about, I guess it's Black men who are members of fraternities who, after their college, still go on the forums and still kind of continue to invigorate or validate that identity. As sociologists, we're not supposed to make judgment calls. That sounds like a pretty positive way that people are using these online forums. So Black Greeks. But I think you also should be, a little concerned here. And I haven't seen a formal sociological study of this yet, but there's some good news articles about the incels. Are you familiar with the incels? Right, these are people. Okay, these are people who consider themselves to be involuntarily celibate. Right, these are. You probably don't listen to Mark Maron, right? Mark Maron calls them the army of unfuckable hate nerds, which is maybe a little much, but these are nerdy guys who spend a lot of time on the computer and who validate this weird identity of being an incel. And then project that into, and I'm sure this isn't everybody, and again, this needs, this is an area ripe for study, but many of them clearly carry this forward into a really violent misogyny, making it like, it's not my problem that I spend whatever it is, 14, 16, 18 hours a day on a computer, and I have poor social skills, and I can't talk to other people and have a proper romantic relationship. It's women's problem, right? Women do bad things, and women are evil people who just don't want to fuck me for whatever reason. And and it has really got carried out into real world violence. So a couple of years ago, there was that shooter in Southern California who just went around shooting women. I think the guy who shot up the yoga studio in Gainesville, right, was in this community. So clearly, in the case of the reclaimers in Ohio that they're talking about, this is an important source of validation, important source of community for these folks. I think we should recognize the dark side of this as well. So incels do this. Clearly, to a large extent, the white supremacist community has moved onto the internet and validates these kind of hateful identities. So it's not all I don't know, roses and unicorns and happy stuff, right? So what does the proximate social structure do? It gives them a space for acceptance. It gives them, and maybe this is sort of in a bracket here, it gives them a space for outreach as well, such that and that's certainly something the incels don't do, such that you go out into the community and gain recognition as a Native American. So, for example, a powwow where you'd have people coming to your events, and they get to see you in your Native American garb, doing Native American things, even though you are, phenotypically a white person. And the idea is that expands people's understandings of what Native Americanness might be. Although it's interesting, Jacobs and her co-author are not really optimistic about this changing broad perceptions. So they're saying, though, within the space of the outreach, so if you're at the powwow, at least during that time, these people feel validated in their identities, right? Which is necessary for really having an identity. Continuing, all right, so other stuff that this brings up, though, again, the main conclusions that I think we really can use, is number one, this, right? The proximate social structures are crucial for identity. And this is, it's almost a, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, does it count? No. From a cultural point of view, things aren't meaningful. And this goes back to our cultural diamond. If there's not a receiver, if you erase that half of the cultural diamond, meaning never happened, right? So that identity just doesn't happen unless you have people to validate it for you. The other point that they try to kind of make as a broad point here, well, it's a useful and interesting one. It's also maybe kind of dubious. Speaking to other racial projects, they are arguing that this is another example that should sort of chip away at our essentialism. And really, what that would mean is that for any ethnicity, any race, we should, or could at least, move away from essential notions that people's ancestries, people's lineages are what's important to identifying as a member of an ethnicity, and that really race and ethnicity are performance. Well, take that point, you know, as you will. I would just point you to, well, I guess we're pretty much at full time now. If you open up a new tab here, maybe I'll just share it for you. Oh, there and there. If you go to Moodle, I shared the case of Rachel Dolezal with you. I don't know if you guys remember her, but this really, you know, calls into question all of the essentialist notions of race and ethnicity. So I don't know if you remember, this was what, 3 or 4 years ago now. This woman was the head of the Spokane, Washington NAACP, and she turned out to be white, right? So a reporter asked her, are you African American? And she says, you know, I don't understand. And they, you know, and eventually, you know, basically this whole house of cards sort of fell down for her. You know, I don't know. Well, I'll let you think about that. You know, is it okay for African Americans, or no, I'm sorry, for white Americans to, yes, as Joel says, screw Rachel Dolezal. You know, and that is, you know, I think how that basically shook down, right? Like people are not willing to go there because there are some real issues of essentialism and ancestry and family histories that maybe really are more culturally meaningful than any sort of performance of identity that you could carry out. Okay, are there questions? I see we're at full time. Not seeing any. Okay, so just looking at my schedule, which is revised now, we're looking at Ehrman, no. Jacobs, no, that was today. Ehrman is next time, and that's also supposed to be Andrea, so I'll be ready to talk about that on Wednesday, and that's all on Moodle. So thank you guys, good to see you again, and I'll be signing off now.
Bye.
Bye.